Hello, everyone. Today I have with me two very esteemed economists from the IDB. I have Maria Alejandra Zegara. She is an economist in the Caribbean department at the IDB. I also have Henry Mooney, who is an economic advisor at the Caribbean department of the IDB. And we're here today to discuss their quarterly economic bulletin on the Caribbean and what their ideas and thoughts are on the economic impact of COVID-19 on the Caribbean, especially as it relates to tourism, remittances, and of course, the broader economic implications coming from these channels. So in the first place, let me ask Henry to give us a brief overview of the bulletin's overall economic outlook and ideas around how things are going to develop in the Caribbean over the next few months.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having us, Marla. I hope you can hear me properly. It's our pleasure to be here. So you mentioned the quarterly bulletin. So our department, the Caribbean department, releases a bulletin providing an overview of economic developments and other issues in our region, specific to the countries that the IDB focuses on in the region, which include the Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. Obviously, the events of the last few months have been a top priority for all of us. So our latest quarterly bulletin is focused on the COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak and the implications that it might have for our economies. So the document covers a lot of ground and looks primarily at the key transmission channels for this shock to our economies. The ones that we identify as being the most significant include the domestic channel and the external channel. And the domestic channel obviously relates to sort of the impact of not only the outbreak domestically and its implications for the workforce and for those who become ill, but also the cost to economic demand domestically and activity from the preventative measures, as well as the stimulus and other kinds of measures that the government will have to put in place. We focus as well on the external channel, which we think is particularly significant for our region. And the external channel basically focuses on three sorts of flows: physical flows, in our case, tourism; trade, which includes commodities as well as tourism receipts; and financial flows. So we think that all of those external channels will also be impacted to different varying degrees across our countries. Of course, of the 6 countries that we focus on, 3 are highly tourism dependent, and that's Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas. And the other 3 countries are more oriented towards commodities trade. So we think that the impact is going to be significant. In fact, as we detail in our analysis in the quarterly bulletin, we took a historical view. We tried to assess if there were any precedents over the last 20 years anyway to this kind of shock to our economies. And after looking at a lot of data and compiling some original data sets, we determined that this is really without any precedent. And for that reason, we think that the shock is going to be quite significant.
I agree. And so let me just stop you there to just highlight that point that you've made, that in the last 20 years, we've not seen anything like this in the region, no. Especially the global financial crisis. Because it's important that you made that point, and I want to highlight it because when you look at what the 2009 global financial crisis did to the region, it provides an interesting benchmark, but a flaw as to what this will look like. And that's something that I think, because we don't have data and we don't know what this is going to look like, at the very least, we know that it's going to be worse than 2009. And that's why I just wanted to make sure that we highlight this point here, because I think it does at least provide policymakers and analysts and so on at least one benchmark off of which to measure and to analyze what the future might look like.
I completely agree. And again, when we began doing this sorts of analysis more than a month ago, there was even more uncertainty around what the implications might be. And as you mentioned, the global financial crisis came to everyone's mind as sort of the most logical benchmark. So we compiled, actually, Maria Alejandra put together an original data set for tourism arrivals, both in terms of air traffic and cruise traffic. And we looked at that and compared it to these different shock events. Actually, maybe I'll let Maria Alejandra talk about sort of the shock events that we analyzed, but the conclusion was that not only is this not comparable to what happened during the global financial crisis, in fact, historically, the largest shock we ever saw year on year in terms of tourism inflows was about 6% for the last 20 years. We're talking about an order of magnitude difference here, perhaps as much as 60%, right? So this is, to put that in perspective, there is really no comparison. There is no historical precedent. But Maria Alejandra, maybe you can say something more about the tourism data and the shocks that we found.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Henry and Marla. So definitely, when looking at financial crisis and also other events that affected globally the economy, like other episodes, we haven't really found like a similarity, basically because we're facing now travel bans all over the world. Like people can't really move around. So everybody's been affected by this, and tourism sector, because it's always like something that people decided to take when they have money to actually take vacations on. It's very difficult to also now think about taking vacations, right? And we can't because we're all in quarantine. So definitely tourism is gonna go very low this year, and or maybe until this quarantine finishes, right? So yeah, basically this is an unprecedented event, and countries, tourism-dependent countries, really have to work on the consequences that this is going to have on the region, right? And because there's no substitute for tourism and the amount of employment that they have in on that sector, this is a very huge challenge for countries. Yeah.
Indeed, and what I find even more, I suppose, frightening about the tourism impact. We know that there is the shutdown and the travel ban. And that, as you said, discretionary spending means that people will only spend on a Caribbean vacation when they feel confident of their income, and and that this is not money that they need to spend. But what is also, I find, even more frightening is the fact that travel itself and tourism, especially on the cruise ships, has been such a big part of how this disease spread, this virus spread in the first place. And so that has created not just a demand effect in terms of your income, but it has created a fear in people's minds as to, okay, if I had money to spend on a vacation and I wanted to vacation, I'm going to think really hard about where I vacation and how I get there. And so, for example, there was a survey done in the US where they found that 83% of the respondents said that if they were to go on a vacation in the next 12 months, it will most likely be a staycation in their own country that they drive to. So, and the reason for that is because of their fear of getting on a plane or getting on a cruise ship. So we have kind of those two hits to the tourism sector, the income effect of everybody's income being affected, but the fear factor, I think, is also tremendous. What are your thoughts on how do we deal with that?
Yes, that's a huge challenge. Definitely, countries will have to be creative on how to change that mindset. The cruise sector definitely is going to be hit hard. I'm not really sure on like the behavior of the people, if they are going to change their preference soon. This might take some time. I don't know how much. It actually depends on how safe they can feel in the future. And that's really, and it actually depends on how the cruise companies, what they provide, what they can provide to the customers, right? And also the countries, if they actually feel that they are going to have a good time because it's vacations, right? They will take that option. So yeah, so now the Caribbean economies are competing not only among themselves to receive these tourists, but also with the rest of the world, because they are also going to try to recover their clients, right? So you have to be creative. You really have to show that you are like a country that respects the tourists and you're going to have a good time there, right? So yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to take a while, especially since, it's going to take a while for us to have a vaccine, and I think that's the one thing that will make people safe if they're vaccinated. Sorry, go ahead, Henry.
No, I mean, I agree with everything mentioned. I think as we highlight in the report, actually, and it's based on this data set that we were able to compile, as you mentioned, things like the cruise sector, I think, are going to be very severely affected. We've seen that already, and probably, the psychological impact of this will last even longer. And based on our data, for example, the Bahamas, 77% of all tourism arrivals come via the tourism sector, and for Jamaica, about 40%, right? And when you take that and you think about the aggregate impact of tourism on their economies, so in the case of the Bahamas, the World Bank and the World Trade and Tourism Organization calculate that about 50%, 48% of the total output of the economy is related to tourism, right? So when you think about exactly what I just mentioned, and what you discuss about the psychological implications that will last longer than the crisis, this could be a crisis with a very long tail, right? So one that has a very significant impact over even longer than the actual epidemic itself. So I think these are things that need to be thought about in terms of the recovery, in terms of how these industries can reposition themselves.
And actually, that's a perfect segue into what have you found? I know that in the quarterly bulletin, there is a section where you do a nice table that outlines what were the policy approaches that various countries have taken in response to this crisis. What are your thoughts on what countries are doing? What should they do? What shouldn't they do at this time?
I mean, it's a very good question, and I think I have to tell you, I in particular have spent a lot of time talking with the private sector in the countries that we're working with and the governments, trying to think through the policy options available to governments. I mean, I think back to the original point, this is a crisis like no other, really, historically. So the conventional tools that governments have at their disposal in terms of policies for stimulus, many of them were not designed for this kind of crisis, right? And many of them in that context are not particularly useful. So I think the governments around the world that we have seen that have responded most effectively to this have been doing a good job of adapting, their response to the specifics of this situation. As I mentioned, right, economic policy is very good at influencing people's behavior, right? And by adjusting the relative price of things and adjusting people's incentives to save, to invest, and to spend. Well, this is a crisis where typical stimulus isn't going to be particularly effective because the government has also imposed, restrictions on people's ability to transact, right? So, I think the ethos in terms of developing policies here for countries is to make sure that it's really targeted, focused, and temporary. And when I say targeted, I mean targeted on the only thing that governments really should be doing right now, which is protecting their assets, right? So protecting private capital that's productive, that is just being shocked in the short term in terms of its cash flows, protecting human capital, right? Making sure that you're protecting your citizenry and making sure that as few of them get sick as possible. And then protecting sort of the infrastructure that the economy needs to get back up and running afterwards. So I think that in general is the big challenge here, because we're in uncharted territory and typical policies probably have less impact than they would in other circumstances.
I agree. And it's, it's one big experiment right now, right? Because we've never been through this before and we don't actually know what works and what doesn't work. So we have to try our best, and I know that governments are grappling, and it's a good thing that they have folks like you guys at the IDB and the other development banks and the IMF and so on, who have the kind of technical know-how to at least give some guidance, because it must be very daunting to have to face this kind of challenge, not knowing in your toolbox of policy tools what will work and what wouldn't work, and what will have unintended consequences and side effects and so on.
Yeah.
What I have found that, you know, in looking across the region at what is being done and what isn't being done and what some countries are doing versus others, I think that one thing that is cross-cutting across all of the ones that I feel are doing the best job is not necessarily that I agree with all of their policies and what they're doing, but they have a really good communication strategy. In other words, they are explaining to their people what they know, what they don't know, in terms of the numbers of people infected, in terms of the numbers of job losses, in terms of the numbers of businesses that are closing down and that kind of thing. And they tell their people, here's what we're going to do, and here's what we think it will be, what our policy result will be. And so that kind of communication that explains the situation, explains the approach or the policy solution that we're implementing, and then explains what the consequences and the results we're looking for look like, I think that really helps to give people a sense of comfort and confidence, which is very much needed right now, because everybody is pretty scared as to what's going on. And it's unfortunate, I think, that in some countries you're seeing really good communication, and then in others it's really missing. Do you have any thoughts, both of you, Maria Alejandra, as well, as to how countries can improve their communication? Which countries do you think are doing a good job? What works, what doesn't work? I think communication is such a big part of the recovery strategy for this crisis, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I can take a first crack at that. I mean, as an old central banker myself, you know, I completely agree with you that communication, transparency, and predictability are really the most important hallmarks of effective policy, right? I mean, I think the thing that psychologically the worst thing in terms of incentives for economic participants in an economy is uncertainty, right? Now, there's already so much uncertainty related to this crisis. How many people will be infected, when, that if you add also unpredictability in terms of the policy reaction of countries, that makes things even worse. So I think, to your point, countries that have done it well have been out communicating not only how the virus is spreading, but what their approach is going to be. You know, if they're going to close the economy or certain sectors of the economy, countries like Jamaica have done a very good job, for example, of explaining why they're imposing curfews, why they are shutting down certain sectors, why and they have been closing the airports, giving the public some sense of the rationale for an action, I think is very important. And at the same time, making sure it's very targeted to try and address the problem that you're facing. I think that's also extremely important.
Of course, and as we're on Jamaica, I mean, to me, their central bank, Bank of Jamaica, has the best communication strategy of any central bank in the whole world. And they've been doing.
You're not alone in that.
I know, and they've been doing a really great job as well as a central bank, even at this time, to communicate, you know, how their policy approach is supportive of a recovery. Maria Alejandra, I just want to touch on that communications point with you with respect to, because you talked about, you know, countries have to be creative and have to be able to win the hearts of the potential tourists again. And of course, part of a regional communication strategy is work that you guys are doing at the IDB as well, in this quarterly bulletin and other research that you guys are putting out. But with respect to tourism in particular, are you aware of any kind of regional, perhaps, approach to the tourism recovery strategy? Because that's a question that I have been getting from a lot of people, because, you know, individual countries are dealing with their own thing. But is there any sort of a regional approach, including one with respect to communication and marketing and so on?
Yes, so definitely when talking about what is happening and what are the policies that should be taken, we have to take into account also the psychological effect that this information is going to have on the people. And they have to feel like the government is taking care of them, right? So on that side, I feel like the governments are doing a great job on that. It's very difficult to transmit all these messages. There are a lot of messages. It's like how to prevent the disease, what we're gonna do, how are we gonna help you and your families, and there's a lot of things that you have to communicate, and it's a challenge. But I think that most of the countries are doing a great job, because if you are really taking care of the people, and like the people will notice. And on how the tourism sector can recover from this, creative ways. For instance, some of the touristic activities that you could do, you cannot do it anymore, right? You cannot be on the site, but you can think of using virtual tools to provide similar experience. So for instance, I don't know about any good wine on the region, but I know about a good rum on the region, the Caribbean region, right? Why don't you have like a catering of rum, and you show like how to actually taste rum, and you'll be like, okay, connect, and I'll teach you more about the history about the rum, I don't know, in Barbados, for instance, and how you know that it's a good rum. So you actually start having all these activities, virtual activities, and you connect, and you can actually can have like a substitute on that side, right? Like similar experience that you're not going to be there, but you can actually have a similar one. Or also like virtual classes on that, like Zumba classes. I just had, like the other day, we organized a soca Zumba class, and I love it, seriously. And
you need to send me the link to the soca Zumba class. I am so ashamed I'm not aware of this.
Oh, it's so good. You'll love it. And those kind of things are the ones that continue with the cash flow, right? Like people are gonna pay for those services, and it's still gonna enjoy a lot. I mean, I know it's not physical, like you're not gonna be there, but still you have a great video, you have a great experience. A couple of hours with your family learning something from the Caribbean. So that's the way, like, you have to think creative. And also, like, the tools you have to use for that are like, well, Wi-Fi, and you know, and that's actually something that we have as a challenge, right? We are now facing right now in this conversation. We would like to have it like if it was like a physical one, like, and the speed of the Wi-Fi could be like a problem, right? So the government should also think about how you can give access to all the people to good public services like that, so they can actually continue having their activities, right, in a creative way, like adapt in an adaptive way.
I agree. And one of my favorite hotels that's been, I think, dealing with this in a creative way is Jade Mountain in St. Lucia. Every day they put out an inspirational quote with a very pretty picture of the pitons in St. Lucia, and they do a stream of yoga sometimes, and you know, and they have actually a live stream so that you can watch, you can put it on, and you can watch the scenery on the ocean. Yeah, go to Jade Mountain's website. They have a live. It's beautiful. And so you're right. I think that, you know, rather than just shut down, go home, and wait for everything to open up, I think we have to, not just to tourist related activities, all businesses need to think about how do I remain front of mind in the minds of my customers and my potential customers. What can I do to keep that engagement alive and open and positive at a time like this? And there is a lot of opportunity to do things remotely that can help people to regard your brand in a positive manner, so that when they have the opportunity to spend, you know, you're going to be one of the first that come to their minds. And I feel like there is real opportunity to do a little bit more of that in the region.
If I can interject, I mean, building on the same point, and it's a conversation I've had with some private sector operators, for example, in Jamaica. You know, I think another thing that the companies, corporates need to be thinking about is also the opportunities in this crisis, right? I mean, as you know, unfortunately, you know, every crisis will will have a negative impact on many industries, but it also presents opportunities. And I'll give you an example that we were discussing, and it relates to a sector that's very important for the Jamaican economy: business process outsourcing, right? So call centers, but also virtual service provision, you know, from across the spectrum of the value-added scale, right? One thing that the crisis is making very clear in advanced economies is that virtual work is much more viable than people have thought, right? I mean, this was a trend that was underway already, right, across the globe. And I'll give you a personal example. My wife happens to work in real estate development, so she works for a commercial real estate developer, and is now in real estate strategy. And I can tell you there are conversations already happening where big corporates in the United States and elsewhere are saying, you know, this experiment has worked so well. We've had people working remotely and offsite for such a long time that we're not going to renew contracts for some of our office buildings because we're going to start to have people work from home, which means you can have people not only work from home in your own city, but work from home anywhere in the world. So exactly. The whole trend towards virtual employment, virtual service provision, that is going to accelerate because of this crisis, right? And countries like Jamaica that have already invested a great deal in that sector and have natural advantages, for example, like being native Anglophones and being able to, you know, work with many of the advanced economies across the globe, they should be thinking very about how they can position themselves for the region. And this is one of many, I'm sure, you know, green shoots that you can think about that will emerge from this. And I think countries that will recover, but also, you know, make strides, leaps forward, the ones that think very hard about how they can position the post-COVID economy.
Yeah, I agree. So, because everything is going to change, right? Nothing's going to be the same going forward. So let me just give you a few minutes.
Well, hopefully not nothing, but you know, certainly things are going to change, yeah. Right?
Tremendous change is underway. So maybe we can wrap up and get just some closing thoughts and remarks from each of you. I'll go with you first, Maria Alejandra.
Yes, so I feel like this is an historical event, like we'll always remember and go back to. And all the lessons that we're going to have from this experience, I just hope that makes us better as a society, right? So we just realize that there are a lot of structural problems that now are arise, right? Like inequality and how you're going to solve that. Some people are not going to have actually income during these times because their jobs are very vulnerable, right? A lot of informality, and all those people are like not going to have like the opportunity to get an income in some time, right? So I am an economist, but now I'm going to talk like a human being. You know, we have to be solidary, right, with each other. This actually teaches that everybody could have like a very shock event in their lives, but we're going to get through if we are all together on this. I mean, if we think about the other one and think about how we can help each other, I think everything is going to get better soon. And we also have to think that this is probably going to get repeated. I mean, scientists have been saying this for a long time, so we have to be prepared. We just can't just forget this and be agile. We just have to adapt to new circumstances, but always in an empathic way. We have to understand, like, if someone's struggling, like, oh yeah, I can't just work because my coworker, which is my son, is like coming into the room all the time. You just have to be, you know, understand those situations. Yeah. And I feel like we are all like in the world gonna be a better person. Also, like, I know that the GDP is gonna decrease a lot, but the important thing is to share now what we have and guarantee that people are having at least something that they can get in and say, okay, I can take this and move on, right?
Yes, I agree with you. And I think things just definitely will change in a more compassionate and sustainable way going forward. I feel that's going to happen. Henry, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, along similar lines, I mean, I think, you know, this is an opportunity to think about what's important. And right, in a crisis like this, the most important thing is the lives of your citizens and their livelihoods, right? And making sure that you preserve some sense of normalcy as well as, you know, the health of your citizens. And so that has to be the first priority. But the second priority has to be preserving their livelihoods, right? So making sure that whatever interventions these governments take, and they should take, you know, they should take every measure available to them that makes sense, that, you know, it preserves the economy's ability to function after the crisis, ideally helps position these economies to thrive after the crisis. And along those lines, I mean, especially for European countries that have spent so much of the last decade or two sort of whether it's Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados now, undertaking, you know, significant reforms to try and restore economic sustainability, right, and reduce debt levels, you know, have their institutions function more efficiently economically. To not forget that you have to preserve those gains as well, which means, again, reinforcing the idea that if you're going to undertake spending measures, expenditure measures, that they're very smartly designed, that they're very temporary, and that they're targeted, so that when you exit this crisis, you haven't lost too much of those gains that were, you know, years and years to accrue. Again, debt sustainability, entrenchment, that make sure that you have those as well, because those are also important for your economic future. So it's a very task that governments have, but I think that they have to keep all of those in mind as they go forward. And I think institutions, in terms of the design of policy and implementation of policy, and the private sector, to make sure that you understand what they need to survive, I think is also extremely important.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't envy the policymakers right now with the amount of balls that you've just outlined that they have to have in the air and make sure that they don't drop any. And you know what I think is also important to remember, that they're human beings, they must be exhausted. It's all experimental, the kinds of policies that are being implemented right now. And so mistakes will be made, and we have to forgive, you know, because it's a difficult time for everybody and mistakes will be made. And so we have to have compassion as well for our policymakers and for the inevitable mistakes that will be made once we know that they're really trying their best, you know, and once we're satisfied of that. I want to thank both of you, Maria, Alejandra, and Henry, for the work that you've done, for the work that the IDB has done in putting together this quarterly report. When we send this video out, we will also send a link to the report, because I think it's very important that people understand the scenarios that you've outlined in this report, understand the country-specific analyses as to what are the most important channels via which this virus are going to affect various economies, whether it's tourism, whether it's oil, the oil price, remittances, etc. These are very important elements to understand for each country. And therefore, how do you shape policy based on what the major transmission mechanisms are? I really appreciate the work that you and the team at the IDB has done and continue to do. And I look forward to having more engagements like this in the future to help to flesh out these thoughts and ideas and analyses that you've done, and to share it with the wider public, and to get that conversation going and lift the awareness. I thank you very much, and keep safe and take good care.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Marla.